Please, Father, help us, our worship. Please, Father, give us Holy Spirit and forgive our sin.
Coberson, can you hear me?
Yes.
Coberson?
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
Okay, let's pray. Our Father, uh, thank you so much for this beautiful Sabbath
So,
and so much giving us.
Arden his microphone was making some strange noises. Can any of the rest of you hear me?
Sir, can you hear me?
Sorry.
Arden was trying to offer a prayer.
Yes,
Are
sir.
you having audio issues?
Okay.
Okay, Arden.
Yes,
um,
sir.
uh, your audio is on and off all the time. Can you just keep it on until the prayer is over?
Sir, I have problem with my phone. My friend, she's online through my phone. That's why.
Okay.
Pros
Or-
and sa.
All right, Arden, I see lots and lots of strange noises coming from your account. I'm not sure why, but I may have to remove you if I keep hearing those noises. You need to stay muted.
Yeah, you just keep mute, okay? Arden. Thank you so much.
Coberson, can you hear me?
Yes, Dr. Campbell, I can hear you. Can you? Can you hear me?
Ah, I can hear you now. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can. Yeah, I think you're using earpiece. Yeah.
Okay, that's better. I think we might actually be able to have.
Okay. Also, all right. That was our student, first year student, just fresh student of theology, Prasam Shah. Thank you so much for your words of welcome. And I know that you were not able to complete your prayer because of the audio issue, but it is all right. I'd like to give the time to Jeril to kindly play that song so that it can help us prepare for the next item. This special song is be rendered through video by Florina Gonmai.
Time is passing by, have you realized? A moment lost is lost for eternity. Have you taken but a second just to realize? Yeah, you strayed away, chose an evil way. Now you're full of miseries, lost, and you have no place to hide. You need love, love that's so divine. You feel His loving grace search within you. Yeah, you turn away, say some other day, and pretend that you'll find He's always there to see you through your darkest hour. He'll walk you through when the road ahead gets rough. Just trust in Him. strong. He's always there. He's always there. Love became a man born crucified, the one who came to set all his people free. How the mountain hurt our Savior on until he died. Yet he smiled and said, Lord, forgive their way, want to help them by the side. He's always there to see you through your darkest hour. He'll walk you through when the road ahead gets rough. Just trust in Him when you feel you're going down. You're too weak to carry on. His love is strong. He's always there. He's always there. He's always there to see you through your darkest hour. He'll walk you through when the road ahead gets rough. Just trust in Him when you feel you're going down. You're too weak to carry on. His love is strong. He's always there. He's always
Then we thank Florina for the beautiful number. In times when we are going through tough times, God is always there. And Florina was our former student, and also she served as a teacher in the school, in our Spicer School, and now she's in Manipur. When I was thinking about who will introduce Dr. Michael Campbell, I felt that I think I know him best among all of us here, so I thought, let me do the introduction. Usually I give this to others, but I thought I would do the introduction today. Dr. Michael Campbell was born in Texas to Canadian parents, and he completed his bachelor's at Southern Adventist University, an MA from Andrews University, and a PhD from Andrews University. And he was ordained as a Seventh-day Adventist minister in the year 2008, and spent 5 years in pastoral ministry in Colorado and Kansas. He also served as adjunct religion faculty and lead pastor of Wichita South SDA Church and volunteer police chaplain at Wichita, Kansas in 2012. And that's something that I did not know. And Dr. Campbell moved to the Philippines with his family, where he served for 5 years as professor of church history at the IAS, Adventist International Institute of Advanced Studies, during which he also edited the Journal of Asia Adventist Studies, a peer-reviewed academic journal. And after that, he became a professor of religion at Southwestern Adventist University in Texas. And he was recently appointed as the new director for North American Division, Archive, Statistics, and Research. So he just moved there. In fact, I had been waiting for an opportunity to invite him to speak for our forum, but because of his location, I could not. But once he moved to NAD headquarters, I felt that was the right time. And so I'm so glad that he accepted our invitation to speak to us. And Dr. Campbell has published numerous popular and peer-reviewed journal articles about theology and religious history, served as assistant editor of the Ellen G. White Oxford Handbook of Seventh-day Adventism. I think it is still in progress. And he has written several books. His recent one is 1922, The Rise of Adventist Fundamentalism. And recently, he has found a new passion, as I have seen him hosting Adventist Pilgrimage podcasts. And you can see this as in the YouTube, the podcast, as well as an app. And Dr. Campbell is married to Heidi, who is a PhD student in early modern history at Baylor University. And they have two wonderful children, Emma and David. They are good friends with my kids, and together they enjoy camping, gardening, bird watching, and pathfinders. He loves to go bird watching and collect old books. So thank you, Dr. Campbell, for everything, for your willingness to be a part of us and to present on a very important topic. Thank you so much for your love for our family as well, and for all our theology students here at Spicer. I know it is very early, and I want to apologize on behalf of our department here for the inconvenience we had. This is the first time we experienced this, actually. We thought everything would go smoothly, but technology sometimes comes this way. And thank you for allowing us to use your Zoom for this. I hope that it will be better next time. So thank you so much. And I'd like to give the time to you now.
All right. Thank you, Professor Culberson Langu. I apologize. The sound is coming through garbled in my earpiece. So I thought someone we call it Zoom bombing. Somebody that goes in looks for Zoom meetings and tries to distract, but I can see that was not the case. So my apologies. And thank you for bearing with me. Technology is always great when it works. And of course, it doesn't always work. And at moments, we all have to be patient with one another. So thank you for the invitation, the kind invitation. Culberson, greetings to your family. We, as you said, we love you guys dearly. We think of you as family. And of course, some of you know your professor was one of my PhD students while we were at IS and did an outstanding dissertation, and just really excited to see some of the work that he has both done, both academically as well as pedagogically. Thank you again for the kind invitation. It's a privilege to be able to share a little bit some of my latest research about 1922, which seems very apropos since we're exactly 100 years later, that we can pause for just a moment to reflect on probably what is one of the most controversial General Conference sessions in all of Adventist history. Certainly right up there in league with perhaps 1888, if you've heard of that General Conference session, being very controversial over righteousness by faith and some of those kinds of ideas. So by the time you get to 1922, you have a whole new set of issues, different personalities, and a church that is confronting change. How does one deal with change? That's kind of one of the core issues that I want to get at in our brief time that we have together. And before I delve in, I want you to see a couple things that I find at least quite fascinating. And that is, first of all, you have these little pamphlets that are in the background called the Fundamentals. And we want to define fundamentalism here in just a minute. But I also wanted to see at the bottom of the screen, hopefully you can all see this. Give me a thumbs up if you can see this. Culberson, is it coming through? All right, I see some thumbs up. Thank you.
Yes.
Good. You see, here is an actual photograph of the delegates of the 1922 General Conference session. That was kind of a tradition in early Adventism. Get everybody together, take a group picture, and a little section of that, because you can't have such a large photograph on the cover of a book, but a small section of that on the left center there has become is part of my book, my most recent book, 1922. You can see that there on the cover. And 1922 really continues where I left off with my 1919 book that I published 3 years ago for the 1919 Bible Conference, which was the first major gathering to discuss the significance of Ellen White's writings, their legacy, their authority within the denomination. There were some who were arguing and beginning to innovate and share new ideas about inspiration, new ideas such as inerrancy and infallibility, that there can be no mistakes in inspired writings, as specifically with Ellen White's writings. And those who attended the 1919 Bible Conference, many of them had worked closely with Ellen White, and they knew that that did not accurately describe how inspiration worked in her life, as well as her own explanation of inspiration. She always said that God is this creating this sort of difference between the pen and the penman, right? So she's this instrument, this pen whom God is using, but God doesn't dictate those words. God inspires the thoughts and ideas, and then she communicates those as accurately as she possibly can to those around her, to whom the message or the recipients are to receive this message. That could be a person, a church, could be general conference leaders. And so 1919 is this moment when the church is confronted with not only change outside of the church, but change inside the church. Because you'll remember that Ellen White had died and she's no longer around anymore. So when she's alive, people had questions. They could actually write her a letter. What did you mean when you said X, Y, Z, whatever it might be that you were that you had concerns about, so to speak. So these are various aspects of the Bible Conference. And one other interesting aspect of it is that it takes place just after World War I, which is this huge battle, global battle. More people die in World War I than all the previous wars combined in human history. Tragic and devastating. And these are all Christian nations that are fighting with one another. So that lessens the morale of those who participate even more. So when I did a lot of fun, I think it's still very significant for our understanding of theology and Adventist history. But I wanted to go a step further. So my project during COVID was, what was the aftermath? What happened next after 1919, right? What happened in the wake of that, and how did it change Adventism? So in 1922, I look at those paths and I explore them. And I think I sent your professor a copy of my book. In fact, I think I sent 2 copies, one for Spicer as well as one for him. So that book, I trace the story, part of the story that I'm going to share with you today. I don't have time to go into all of the story because it's a very complex story, and there is much material that needs to be evaluated and far longer than we have time for here today. But I come back to this question that I started out asking. What is fundamentalism? Because that's at the heart of our topic for today. What is fundamentalism? Well, a lot of people define it in different ways. The 2 book covers that are most famous are Ernest Sandin, The Roots of Fundamentalism, and then there's George Marsden's book on Fundamentalism and American Culture, that was published by Oxford in, I think it was 1980, has become the definitive classic in the field, trying to define what is exactly fundamentalism. And this is a very essential question for us to ask starting out, because if we don't understand this, we're not going to understand a bunch of other things that kind of follow in its wake. By the way, I should kind of jokingly mention that when I was, I took a doctoral seminar at Notre Dame under George Marsden, one of the, probably still the foremost scholar in the world on fundamentalism. And one day in class, he said, well, fundamentalism is like an evangelical who's mad about something. Well, who are the evangelicals? In American religion, evangelicals have historically been the traditional white Protestant person that would grow up in an American context. And so you have this sort of changes happening within society and threats that were going on to modernism, through evolution, through people that are teaching new ways of higher criticism of the Bible, people questioning the validity of miracles in the Bible. All of those kinds of things were irritating and causing fundamentalists or who become known as fundamentalists to question and ask, really how significant is this? And so this is a big part of what's going on, is this context. And so and evangelical is just another term for Protestant. So the wider Protestant or evangelical culture in America was rapidly eroding. It was changing. So you have these internal threats as well as external threats to Christianity as it is known in America in the early 20th century. Couple highlights here is that it's a reaction to modernism. I've already mentioned that, but these with World War I, for example, right? You need to militantly defend your faith and defend your country, that this is your Christian duty. And again, this becomes a little bit strange, because what do you do when you have Christians on both sides of the war claiming righteous justification for a holy cause in which they believed? You have a reaffirmation of the divine veracity of scriptures, miracles, and atonement. So this is where these challenges to the traditional beliefs of Christianity are such that fundamentalists want to double down on what exactly they do believe in the fact that it comes from the Bible, which ultimately leads to this final point, this idea of divine inerrancy of inspired writings. So there should be a rule in theology that thou shalt not do theology against thy neighbor, because sometimes what we do is when we do theology, we do it in opposition to someone else. And then what we end up doing, instead of listening and coming closer together, we fight each other and drive each other farther apart. We polarize one another. And one of the ways that conservative Christians, and especially Adventists, began to, in this polarization process, in order to defend the divine veracity of inspired writings, they began to increasingly point to the divine inerrancy of inspired writings, both the Bible and Ellen White. So we have to ask ourselves the question that the former review editor, and I was just attending annual council the last few days, and so there's now a new Adventist review editor, Justin Kim. Well, 2 editors ago, there was Bill Naughton. Before him, there was Bill Johnson. Bill Johnson wrote this most incredible editorial I've ever seen. He's laying the question in the groundwork. Are Adventist fundamentalists? It's right as he's beginning his tenure in the early 1980s as the editor of the review. And so he asked that question, are Adventist fundamentalists? And he says with a resounding no, Adventists are not fundamentalists. We are not fundamentalists. And yet, if we asked that same question 100 years ago, Adventists uniformly and consistently would have said, yes, Adventists are fundamentalists. And some of my favorite quotes from the 1920s that I have found are to the effect that Adventists are the true fundamentalists, or the fundamentalists of the fundamentalists. And this is important to understand, this Adventist subvariety, this Adventist adaptation of fundamentalism for their own world and mindset. And so this is what I argue in my 1922 book, is the genesis of what I call Adventist fundamentalism. Adventist fundamentalism. And one of the ways we see Adventism changing, this is just a little tidbit on the side, is in regard to race and gender. Race, that you see the earliest Adventist pioneers were abolitionists, very socially progressive, but by the early 20th century in America, you have separate black and white conferences, regional conferences. how did that happen? How did that reversal happen? Well, I would argue it had everything to do with fundamentalism. Same thing and true of gender. In 1910, there's over 1,000 women involved in ministry in the Seventh-day Adventist Church. But by 1930, after 2 decades of going through fundamentalism, she went ahead and sorry, I lost my train of thought. Still early in the morning. The Coberson, what did I just say? Sorry, I had just lost my train of thought for a second.
Something 1930.
Yeah, by 1930, thank you. 1930, there is no women left in the denomination. So you go from 1910, where there's over 1,000, to 1930, when there's basically none. And you see a huge reversal. And fundamentalist rhetoric was using that very much so to argue the point of the submission of women and pushing women out of leadership, out of pastoral ministry in the Adventist denomination, as well as in the wider fundamentalist movement. So we see these parallels both in fundamentalism and in what I call or term Adventist fundamentalism, okay? I see a raised hand, and I'll take some questions here in just a few moments, so don't forget your question, or you can just jot it down in the chat so I can just kind of keep my thoughts coherent here this morning, and we can keep moving along. But I promise we will come back and we will have some time for discussion, and I look forward to a chance to have some discussion with you here soon. Well, to the 1922, the actual General Conference session. There have been fierce debates going on within Adventism, but it wasn't whether or not Adventist fundamentalism was good or not. Everyone agreed on that. In fact, at the 1919 Bible Conference, both the, which is, by the way, the first time in Adventist history people use the terms like conservative against liberal, the progressives against the traditionalists. So you have this polarization going on. You have these same issues keep recurring within Adventism. So Adventists see themselves as the true fundamentalists, the fundamentalists of the fundamentalists. And so even the progressives in 1922 were overall, in the big picture, the big scheme of things, they were definitely fundamentalists. They were very conservative. Yeah, it didn't mean that there weren't people that questioned and said, you know, I don't think that some of our church leaders are faithful enough. They're not spiritual enough. They're not supportive enough of Ellen White. And the reason they could say that is, well, some of our church leaders don't believe in the inerrancy and infallibility of Ellen White's writings. They believe in thought inspiration, which, had they checked, they would know Ellen White actually did teach that. But they were beginning, unbeknownst to themselves, were beginning to teach new ideas about inspired writings that were not in harmony with Ellen White and our early Adventist pioneers. So you begin to see some tensions that are building. Some more of these tensions that build include two men by the name of Claude Holmes and J.S. Washburn. Now, I've never been able to find a picture of Claude Holmes. I have found a picture of J.S. Washburn. And the two of them decide, they make up their minds that the 1919 Bible Conference was not only evil, they called it a diet of doubts, but that A.G. Daniels specifically was the ringleader in the apostasy of the church. So there's a very strong feelings by some, a few, that become very shrill, we say, very outspoken, because it's the most outspoken on people that socially, that are polarized. I'm in here in the United States. So we've had in our politics in America in recent years, a lot of polarization where I would suspect the majority of people are somewhat much more moderate, but it's the people on the extremes politically, on the far right and the far left, that seem to get the most attention because they say the most outrageous kinds of things. That's probably true of politics in any country, although it just seems to be particularly bad right this moment. But Washburn and Holmes, they decide that Daniels is bad news, so they decide they're going to can him. So they found out that if they had enough resources that that they could take and attack Daniels with the intent and purpose of trying to remove him as president of the General Conference. Part of the reason that they discovered that Daniels was not teaching inerrancy or the infallibility of Ellen White's writings had to do with the 1919 Bible Conference. And it also had to do with the fact that at one point they sweet talked their way into the General Conference archives and said, you know, we really want to see the testimonies. So they go in there and the innocent archivist brings them out letters and they copy everything. What they didn't realize, they weren't supposed to have access because some of those were personal and private testimonies by Ellen White to Daniels, giving him specific counsel. Well, when Daniels gets back from his trip, he asks basically, or these two men ask for a meeting with Daniels, and they tell him, you better resign or we're going to publish these Ellen White quotations, these Ellen White letters of testimony that she wrote to you. He said, you need to return those. Those aren't your property. And they refused. And ultimately, at the end of the day, they ended up getting terminated from church employment. And both of them kind of became a little bit bitter, we might say. So Daniels is one of the key figures. He's the General Conference president going into the 1922 General Conference session. Now, in the days and weeks leading up to the 1922 General Conference session, the second person in charge of the denomination is the Secretary of the General Conference, who at that moment was William A. Spicer. Now, the pictures you have are the actual pictures from 1922 at the 1922 General Conference session, which says a little something because it allows us to visualize just a little bit who these individuals were and what were their contributions. Now, remember that A.G. Daniels had been church president from 1901 all the way up to 1922. He was certainly planning to continue to run, but as Spicer and others in the days and weeks leading up to it, as they traveled, they heard increasingly rumors that there were tensions. There was a plot underfoot to try to get rid of Daniels, those kinds of things. And what ends up happening at the actual 1922 General Conference session, and if you look in my book, on 1922, and your professor should have one there, you will see in the back there is an appendix of a letter that Spicer writes to his wife, Georgia or Georgina. And in that letter, he is explaining to her how he had promised he wouldn't take any more positions. And yet, when he, as the days and weeks lead up to the 1922 General Conference session, Spicer had heard rumors. Here are these attempts to get rid of Daniels. And so you have Daniels, number one, Spicer, number two, these two top positions of the church. And the delegates are locked. They're in a deadlock, gridlock. And we know this partially because the newspapers in San Francisco, where the General Conference session was held for that particular time, that the newspapers reported on the meetings, and they talk about some of this very strong feelings and strongly worded speeches that delegates were making. Incidentally, that was 1922. Spicer had promised his wife, Georgina, I am not going to serve anymore. I'm going to retire. And instead, he comes home after promising her this, stating that he had been elected General Conference president. Probably the most reluctant General Conference president we ever had. He didn't campaign for it. He didn't even want it. But as the delegates were locked in a bitter debate over who to be the next leader of our church, it seemed pretty clear they didn't want Daniels to continue. But if Daniels didn't continue, who would actually be their leader? So this is one of the key cruxes or challenges or problems of the 1922 General Conference session. I thought you might like to see some pictures inside of the 1922 GC session. This is also right after World War I, so you can see banners with American flags. This is the rise of the modern notion of Christian nationalism, the idea that to be a good Christian is to be a good American. Now, this is kind of, I think, important to highlight because Adventism is not an American religion, even though it, with William Miller, did start in America itself. It is a biblical teachings, but often in certain parts of the world at certain times and places, especially when there is high anxiety in times of war, people sometimes will conflate their religion and their politics together. This is one of the dangers. This is one of the setbacks, and one of the great lessons of this particular lesson is we need to remember how to separate our faith from our politics. I'm not saying that you shouldn't have political views. And by the way, this is not a political comment about whatever's going on in India, because I don't know. I don't keep up with Indian politics. And so this is no reflection on any person or any one country. Suffice it to say, except that at least in America in 1922, there was a strong push to show that they were truly loyal to the as Americans. They weren't going to go over and be spies and that kind of thing. So those are the challenges that are going on, the challenge of Christian nationalism, and it will always be a challenge, because as Seventh-day Adventists, Adventism at its best is when we, well, first of all, when we center on Christ, but we also respect the individual rights and freedoms of others, including those we disagree with. So so there's a picture of inside the delegates, one of the few that we have. And here's another picture that we have. This one's facing from the back of the auditorium up to the stage. Again, notice the big American flags in the background. There's some prophecy charts and missionary maps that are behind the speaker, which is quite interesting. You've got the delegates that are laid out in different sections, etc. And then you have what is the location of the 1922 General Conference session. Now, I actually went there this summer because the convention center is still standing in the downtown city of San Francisco. So if you want an Adventist heritage site and you happen to be going through San Francisco, make sure you don't miss this. That's the Great Columbia or Exhibition Hall, where our church leaders held the 1922 General Conference session. Now, I'm going to end my PowerPoint, but I'm going to conclude by talking about some lessons that can be learned that are really important for us to understand in relationship to the 1922 General Conference. Let's see, here we go. Spotlighting this so you can see me hopefully a little bit better. And what ends up happening at the end of the General Conference session of 22 is the nominating committee realizes they can't put Daniels back in as president. He'd been General Conference president for 21 years, and it was time, it was fitting, it was appropriate that some younger leaders step up to leadership. But there didn't seem to be any good, clear heir apparent, which meant that they had to take a little bit more time to look at some options and do some other family kinds of things. But I think it should be noted that we need to have, it's still early. I woke up really early, and then all this trouble of trying to get on this morning kind of threw me off. The 1922, there at the end, Spicer becomes the General Conference president to take over as a neutral kind of person that everyone on the nominating committee can support. And what ends up happening is they make Spicer, who is the number 2 position as secretary, they make him the General Conference president, and then they make Daniels, who had been in the number 1 position, to put him in the number 2 position as secretary of the General Conference, which helps him to save face. I think that's really important to understand. They didn't want to shame or embarrass. He'd made a lifelong contribution that was very significant, very important. So they didn't want the critics to gain credence to say, oh, look, we took out the General Conference president. We published all this hateful rhetoric and pamphlet wars attacking him. So we won, we got our way. No, they didn't get their way. He's still in a position of leadership. And by the way, if you ever wonder what happened to Daniels after this, he goes on to found the ministerial department of the General Conference, which is then replicated in various other divisions around the World Church, as well as at the General Conference. They start Ministry Magazine. They start a number of major initiatives for pastoral training that is very significant. So Daniel's had plenty of work to do. He was able to keep busy and make a very significant kind of difference in that regard. Spicer, on the other hand, remember he had promised his wife that he was going to retire. Well, he has to send that telegram and explain to her why he felt God was calling him to accept the presidency of the General Conference. And it's during the 1920s under his leadership. We call it, as historians, the golden age of Adventist missions, when Adventist mission giving was at its peak per capita. And you see just how much Adventists believed in mission. Spicer would be just the right kind of person, very calming kind of presence. He wasn't really worked up about a lot of theological kinds of issues. He knew there were issues, they needed to be talked about when they needed to be talked about. But by and large, he needed to focus on what he needed to focus on. So you see essentially trading places. And again, that letter by Georgina by Spicer to Georgina, explaining that is at the very end of the letter. He explains his rationale, which I used in my title for today. And that is, there are no posts of honor, only those of service. I'm going to repeat that. There are no posts of honor, only those of service. I think that's a really important point that we need to remember, that when we look at our leaders, and not every leader is perfect by any stretch. In fact, no leader is perfect. Our only leader who is perfect is Jesus Christ. But I sense of that call to humility in the midst of conflict and struggle, as Adventism tilted or pushed towards what I call Adventist fundamentalism. And I think it was the right person at the right time in the right place. W.A. Spicer, one of my heroes in Adventist history, stepped up to the plate as a very young pastor and was able to make a very positive impact that has stayed with the church all the way up to the present day. So that's some highlights of my presentation this morning. I'm sorry that I'm not as coherent as I normally am, very, very early in the morning, but still yet it's been a privilege to spend some time with you guys to highlight the controversial aspects as well as the changes in Adventist history that occurred pertaining to the 1922, General Conference session. One last final thought is that Adventism would continue to struggle with fundamentalism. That becomes a major, major challenge. Doesn't go away after 1922. And that's the focus of my next book in my series of 1919-1922. The third volume, the third installment will be 1925. And I'll be looking at Adventist involvement and engagement in the Scopes trial, So that's pretty nifty as well. So with that, I will take the spotlight off and I will let Professor Coberson facilitate, or whoever is designated, facilitate the taking of the questions. Thank you very much. It's good to spend a little bit time with you on the Sabbath afternoon, early Sabbath morning for me, and I look forward to our discussion here now.
Thank you so much, Dr. Michael Campbell, for your wonderful presentation. I know I can see that you have some struggles. It's so early over there, and we had to wait another 30-40 minutes for your presentation. Thank you so much. We really appreciate your sacrifice for us, and all of us students here and faculty, we really appreciate. We will go to Pastor Ronald Leon Margie, who is currently doing his doctoral studies at IS.
Oh, good.
Yes, he has been sponsored by the Southern Asia Division to undergo his doctoral studies in New Testament. And so we are very happy that he agreed to be with us to give a response to your presentation. So Pastor Ronald, the time is yours.
I'd like to thank Dr. Campbell for that wonderful presentation. Two remarks to begin with. Number one, I am from the New Testament department, but not from the historical side of the spectrum of our church. So that's a limitation from my side. So kindly accept my apologies for that. And the second reason is I have not gone through the book which you have just released, and so I may not be, that very authoritative, or I may not have that resource in mind while I respond to your presentation. But all in all, I want to. It was a wonderful presentation, giving a history of of how this whole idea of this fundamentalism, which from the external and the internal factors impacted the general conversation of 1922. And also it was a thought-provoking presentation on showing how the changes were made and how the decision was impacted to remove Daniels from the post and to put Spicer, who happened to be a more a neutral person. My observations are that this is a very thought-provoking presentation. I want to thank Dr. Campbell for bringing out this presentation and helping us see the history of our church through these difficult times. One of my observations, or what observation I would like to note, is that there were issues also during the World War, and there were issues in Europe. Probably does that reflect into this issue of fundamentalism, or is that something different which would not be a part of this? That is something probably with the time constraints that has not been dealt with. But I'm very happy, and I'm looking forward to reading this book, and we are open to hearing more from you. Thank you very much, Professor, for that wonderful presentation and that thought-provoking presentation to help us get into your book and understand more about fundamentalism. Thank you very much.
Yes, thank you, Ronald. I appreciate that response. I hope you're able to get a copy of the book. And if I had realized you're at IS, I would have sent a copy to Dr. Ginger, who is just at the annual council with me. And so it's good to see that. Yes, there's a very good book called The Global Expansion of Fundamentalism that is helpful in noting that fundamentalism did spread to other places and other countries and across denominations. It was most pervasive and most militant in a North American context. For example, you can see definitely some strides towards fundamentalism in England at the same time period. But by and large, they tend to not be so militant. They tend to be much more mild and moderate in terms of their outlook, their temperament. Same thing is true in Canada and Australia. Fundamentalism has always existed in the sense that their Christianity is not the only group that has fundamentalists. You have people that are really focused on a very literal and rigid and literalistic way of interpreting inspired writings. And that continues to be a challenge on up to the present.
Thank you very much. There is a thought, the World War II, where the decision of the church was taken to let people make their own decision based on their conscious whether they want to participate in the World War or not, World War I. But of individuals participating in it, and that also led to people trying to decide and brought about issues. How would you respond to that? The people who were they actually termed as fundamentalists, who were actually keeping the commandments of God, and they didn't want to take arms and get into war during World War I, but they, the issue of they were, disfellowshipped and issues crept up. And so is this a part of fundamentalism, or do you see this as something different?
No, it's in a way, it's part of it. The issue of military service has always been an issue. Every time there's a war, there's a question of how will people be involved in the military and so on. In the American Civil War, you see that Adventists tried to stay pacifist. They tried to be conscientious cooperators, we call it, that they weren't trying to fight in any kind of active kind of way. That didn't stop a lot of Adventists, and some historians estimate that about a third of Adventists in the Civil War actually went and fought in the war. So there's always been a history of pacifism, but there's always been a history of people who choose to engage willingly into that warfare. By the time you get to the 1920s, after World War I, the issue isn't still there anymore because the war is over. but some of the underlying issues about
Mm.
the hermeneutics and how people used Ellen White to support their position or not to support their position become increasingly to the forefront of people recognizing. So so it is part of the problem, but it's more of the context, and it's certainly varied in different times and places depending on the location and circumstances. What made World War I unique is it's such a large war where it impacted so much of the world and so many millions of people that it's hard to estimate and fathom just exactly how far that went.
Thank you for that response.
Well, thank you so much, my friend, Pastor Ronald Margie, for joining us and for your response to Dr. Campbell's presentation. We look forward to more time with you in the future and look forward to join Spicer the next few years. After a few years, may God bless you. And now
Thank you.
Thank you. We'll go into the Q&A session. We have about 20 minutes or so for the question answer. We have several questions here. Dr. Michael Campbell, the first question would be very simple. You have already dealt with it, but just for the sake of some students, I would share my screen at this time. Some of the questions I may not be able to type it out because of the lack of time, but a few of them I am able to type out. So let me show that. All right, so the first question I have for you is, in very simple words, how would you define fundamentalism, fundamentalist? This is for the sake of some students who join a little later also. And
yeah, I saw that question in the text box, in the text chat, and it's a great question. Fundamentalism it's not just an idea, it's a whole mindset. And in this case, it tends to be a very militant mindset for defending the faith from threats. And for early 20th century American Christians, those threats had various forms, whether it was the teaching of modernism, the teaching of evolution, questioning the divine inspiration and miracles as found in the Bible. So those are the kinds of things that fundamentalists said, oh, we have a lot of change and we don't like it. Now, the fundamentalists wrote a bunch of pamphlets called the Fundamentals, where hence the name fundamentalism. And in that, or during that space, the defending the faith included, threats of modernism, of evolution, those kinds of things that they felt they needed to double down on the divine inspiration of the Bible. And so the fundamentalism is first of all defined as a historical movement that became very prominent in American religion in the 19-teens and 20s, because that's where the majority of our church members were at that particular moment, where our church headquarters was, where our seminary was located, that this became very influential for Adventists too during the same time. So Adventists were very influenced by the wider culture, and that's been true always.
Great. I think that should clear a lot of minds here. Now, would you say that Adventists are no longer fundamentalists today, or do we still have fundamentalists among us?
That's a great question. And
perhaps
like,
all of us are fundamentalists in some ways.
Yeah, and by the way, I should point out that not all of fundamentalism is necessarily bad, right? I believe in the divine inspiration of the Bible. The problem with fundamentalism is the tendency to go to extremes, going too far. So instead of just defending the inspiration of the Bible, which I would agree with, start trying to prove that the Bible is inerrant and infallible becomes very problematic. And so so you have to remember, fundamentalism is a very broad kind of mindset and so on. Are there no longer fundamentalists? Well, no, they're actually seeing an uptick, an upsurge of fundamentalism around the world. The kind of indicators and trackers that you can see historically from 100 years ago you see those kinds of things recurring. You also see a recurrence of Christian nationalism in a lot of different countries, not just in America, but in many other countries. So we're seeing similar kinds of things. And so I would not say that there aren't fundamentalists anymore, but my job as a historian isn't to go around with some kind of fundamentalism detector, but rather to recognize how the church has dealt with fundamentalism in the past, and therefore could be something hopefully encouraging for those who are able to make it.
All right. Has fundamentalism any implication for salvation?
In the sense that how you understand the Bible and how you understand these kinds of things obviously always have implications for our salvation. But is it possible for someone who's a very sincere fundamentalist to be saved and go to heaven? Well, I think so. I'm glad that I'm not the judge of that. And so again, back to I'm not going around. This is the advantage of being a historian. I can look at historical issues from a century ago, but I don't do that in a way that I'm trying to point fingers today. I'm trying to do it in a way that we can have and create conversations within the church and talk about these issues in the present, but not in a way that's destructive, but in a way that is constructive. And so we need to create those kinds of spaces. So are there fundamentalists? I'm sure there are, but I'm not so worried about it so much as that we learn lessons from the past and history, take the good, and then try to learn from the bad, whatever that might be. But history changes. So history today is not the same as 100 years ago, although it is 100 years and there are some parallels in terms of some of the issues and topics and things like that. Those issues have never been quite resolved. So we have to remember that.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. Here is a question from one of our students. He asked the question, what are your comments on the book Broken Blueprint by Harvest Time? I'm not sure whether you have come across this book.
Yeah, I think I've seen that. I mean, it's there's a good book by George Knight called Myths in Adventism, and it's basically dealing with this idea that there is this ideal perfect blueprint after which all Adventist schools have to be modeled. And if they're not following exactly this blueprint, then therefore those schools are corrupt or somehow less faithful. And that's just a complete misreading of Ellen White and the original sources. And that's most unfortunate. It's also lacking a lot of the historical context. So yeah, I just unfortunately and you notice it's published by Harvest Time. That's not an official publisher of our church. They tend to publish stuff that's, we call it fringe stuff, that is not generally considered as kind of normative within Adventism.
I think that's the book review in the 30 seconds for the student. All right, here's another question. What were the results of the 1919 and 1922 Bible conference? The general conferences, I think.
1919, there weren't any real tangible results, other than that you had some people that were really worked up and polarized on different theological issues within the church. So there weren't a lot of results, which is why I went to 1922 and wrote that book, so I could look at the aftermath. And you have changes in leadership. You have how there's a new philosophy at hand as to, oh, I lost the screen sharing here. The
I went off.
Oh, okay.
But it's okay. You can just continue without the screen.
Yeah. Okay. The so yeah, not all of fundamentalism was bad. Remember, I said that too. So, but 1919, there's not a lot of tangible results afterwards. 1922 is really the tangible result of 1919, where finally there's some changes in leadership. The denomination says, oh, okay, we need to actually work on these issues a bit more. And so 22 is the result of 1919. And from 22, there were a lot of positive results of 1922. And the results of 1922 really have to be seen in 1925. Okay, 1925. And that's going to be my third installment. So I'll have a third book. I'll make this series into a trilogy, 1919, 1922, 1925. There's always room for further research and further expansion of these kinds of conversations with more nuance and better, hopefully self-understanding.
Well, thank you so much, Dr. Campbell. We still have about 10 minutes or so for Q&A, and then we'll have prayer and some remarks from our dean. So before that, we still have a couple of questions, and they are in the chat. Maybe not you cannot see them.
Maybe direct messages because I don't see them. Yeah.
So let me just read it for you.
Mm-hmm.
The first one is now these two questions will be dealing with some leadership issues. So here's the question. It goes like this. Sometimes we come across leaders who unfortunately do not feel the call to humility, and sometimes they throw their weight around and can be observed to be making things political within the SDA Church. So how can we as students bring about a change? How do we, or do we have to wait till we get into a position of service before we can influence this situation?
Yeah, great question. I hope you don't have to wait till you have a position of leadership and influence before you can start to make an impact. In fact, if you wait that long, you probably will never make an impact or a difference, because your philosophy of leadership is not to change things, but to keep and maintain the status quo. So if you see a challenge, it's a good opportunity to look for constructive ways to have conversations and to try to make an impact, to try to make a difference. Leadership matters a great deal, and if you see leaders that are struggling, pray for them, come alongside them, befriend them, those kinds of things, rather than just simply be like Washburn and Holmes and just attack. So again, that's one of the things we can learn from fundamentalism, is how we treat one another actually matters. It matters a great deal. It may even matter more than what we believe in terms of the actual theological concepts, as important as those are. I'm not saying that theology is important, but if it doesn't change the way that we relate with one another with kindness, love, and respect, what good is all the theology that we know intellectually in our heads? So it needs to be both effective as well as effective.
All right. Now I'm just sharing all these questions because I respect everyone, every student here, their concerns. So another question on leadership is it true Adventist elections also have are like the worldly politics, sometimes corruption, giving money to win election, etc. So do we have these situations in our church? It's a question asked by one student. I think you were talking about A.G. Daniels, there were some leadership issues. So I think in regard to that, he was asking this question. Did you get the? Yeah.
I didn't quite get all of it. Repeat the leadership issue.
Yeah. So do we? The worldly politics that we see, do we have them in our church, such as corruption, or giving money in elections?
Oh, absolutely. We still have that, right? I mean, and this is one of the things that we are always going to see, because the church is made up of imperfect human beings, and yet it's still God's church. It's the beloved of his eye, and so our responsibility is to make the church better within our sphere of influence and to hold ourselves accountable to the best of our ability. Is there corruption? Are there people that attack church leaders? Are there both church leaders that are corrupt and church members that are corrupt? Absolutely. But our focus is to try to make the church a better place and to help it fulfill its sense of mission to the best of our ability. If we go around and only look at all the negative things, we'll quickly become very discouraged. But as a experienced church leader told me one time when I was young, that you can either focus on all the negative things and make you negative and bitter, or you can focus on the ways that you can make a difference and a positive impact. And if you do that, you will have the right attitude where you'll be able to grow, you'll be much happier, and God will be able to bless you.
All right, we have just 3 more questions. Before that, Mr. Chakham, can you please mute yourself, Mr. Chakham? If you can hear me, kindly mute your audio. Thank you. I'm going to combine two questions here. One is, has fundamentalism done any good for the church? And how may one stay clear of fundamentalism?
Yeah, and again, I think again the problem is polarization. So everything is good or bad, and so it's all good or all bad. And fundamentalism wasn't all good and it wasn't all bad. As I mentioned, I believe in the divine inspiration of the Bible. I think that's good. That emphasis on the divine inspiration of the Bible is very important. And if we lose that, we will be in trouble. The problem with fundamentalism is that, at least for some fundamentalists, they began to start in their fierce protection of inspired writings, they began to teach inerrancy and infallibility of Ellen White's writings. And that's where it became problematic. Another positive contribution is the Trinity, because the fundamentalists emphasized the Trinity so much. It did help in clarifying and encouraging our church leaders to publish more widely so that church members understood our position on the Trinity. So that's the first thing. Second thing is, I think conversations and dialogue and relationships are where it's at, in terms of if we have a theological disagreement and see things differently, we need to spend more time with our brother or our sister and make sure that they both understand where we're coming from and that we understand where they are coming from. All of those things add up and make a big difference. And, I hope we can create the kinds of spaces in the church where we can continue cultivating conversations to better understand our history, as well as to understand what is fundamentalism and that legacy, and how do we understand it for us today.
The second last question. It was mentioned in the presentation that the fundamentalists discourage women in service.
True.
What steps has the church taken to counter this?
Well, this is still the challenge, right? We still have debates in the denomination about women's ordination. Most women I know aren't asking to be ordained. In fact, very, very, very few are actually asking for that. But as culture has changed and women have become valuable and important members of society, especially in a Western context where it's become very, very important. So I think we need to empower and enable women within the church at all levels, including as pastors, so that they have the support that they need to be able to share the gospel message. Remember, our main point is that as Adventists, we are called with a mission and message to share to the world. That means that we need all hands on deck. We need everybody to be involved and part of that, right? Unfortunately, because of our culture and world that we live in, topics like this have been quickly polarized and become politicized, where it becomes these sort of political kinds of battles. So one thing I've tried to emphasize is how significant the contributions of women were in the late 19th, early 20th century. Towards the Ellen White's death, for example, there were close to 1,000 women that were somehow in leadership, pastoral ministry, some kind of active labor for the Lord. And by 1930, they're almost gone. It's basically almost down to zero. And so that's quite a reversal from early Adventism being very, very empowering of women and encouraging them to preach. If you don't believe me, just look to the example of Ellen White. Here's a woman who is preaching in the pulpit and people are coming to listen. This was a novel thing, but Adventists were innovators. They were creative and they were willing to try new technology and new kinds of things that would help them and enable them to be able to share the Adventist message that they believe so much. So that's a big part of that particular story. And what can be done today? I think recognizing the contributions of women. We need to empower women to be involved in the church at all levels. And again, I'm not trying to make a political statement. I'm not talking about women's ordination. I'm just talking about mission. We need all hands on deck, but recognizing some of the theological implications that people had in restricting the contributions of women, you begin to realize that there were a lot of women in early Adventism, but unfortunately whose stories we don't know or whose stories are not well known. And because of that, as a historian, we need to do more to try to understand and support women within the church. It's a part of our mission. It's a part of who we are.
All right, we come to the last question. I have typed it out again. I could not copy it, so I have to type it myself again. You can see in the chat, Dr. Campbell, questions right there. It reads, proto-fundamentalism in Adventism today may be a heritage of the 1922 GC session. How can our present leaders in the SDA Church embrace the motive that there are no posts of honor, only those for service, especially in a time when our church is plunged with the present polarizing views?
Yeah, I don't know that there's any magic formula. I think it comes and begins and starts by the surrendered heart, having a converted heart, giving our lives to Jesus every day. It's very easy, even doing good work for the church, to make that ministry and those kinds of things about oneself. And I think we have to, by dying daily, as Paul says, we surrender our lives, ask God to lead. And when we fall in short, we need to repent of those kinds of things, right? And I think that kind of attitude that Spicer had is something that we can benefit from today, and having relational ministry and recognizing that, you know, if you're a pastor the rest of your life, God bless you, you know. If you serve in the conference office, God bless you too, you know. That pastoral ministry is the highest calling in the denomination. Unfortunately, we have not set ourselves always up to affirm and reward that appropriately. But yet, if we didn't have our pastors on the front lines, where would we be today? And this is one of the challenges that we have. And so, and I think we do it by also role modeling ourselves in our own lives, as our, you know, in our cases, our kids are teenagers and growing up, so that they have good, effective, I lost my train of thought there. They can have a good, effective way of furthering the mission of the church.
Right. Thank you, Dr. Campbell. We have come to the end of the Q&A. I would give the time right now to our Dean, Dr. Mohan Ras Israel, the Dean of the Division of Religious Studies, to give a remark at this point.
Thank you very much, Dr. Corbison. I want to take the opportunity to thank Dr. Michael Campbell for that very fine presentation. Thank you, Dr. Michael. I've had a chance to meet with you once or twice, I think, in some conference, and I was very much impressed by your presentation. I'm sorry I've not had a chance to read your book, but I'm sure I will be able to in the near future. And this is a very, very important topic that you've chosen on the 922 General Conference session, and particularly highlighting on fundamentalism. Thank you for explaining what it is, and especially for our students, it has been, I believe, a blessing. Thank you for sharing those pictures as well. That has helped us to see what happened then. Dr. Corbison has always held you very high. He has always mentioned about you and how you help him with books and things like that. And so we really appreciate your contribution directly or indirectly to our department. And today we want to thank you in a very special way for this fine presentation. And we are looking forward to having more of you in the future. I want to also thank Brother Ronald Margie. Ronnie, nice to see you with us, and for your response that you made. I'm glad that you are doing your doctoral studies in New Testament. We are waiting for a New Testament professor. You may be aware that we lost two of our biblical studies teachers, one Old Testament, and very soon the New Testament professor also left. So we are really struggling. And even during the AAA inspection that we had last week, this was one of the strong recommendations that was made, that we cultivate students for biblical studies, and I'm glad you're doing New Testament, and I'm sure one more will join you soon for Old Testament, and it will be able to strengthen our department. So thank you for your response, and thank you for the questions. The students, I think, raised some very, very good questions. And thank you, Dr. Campbell, for answering those questions. I'm so sorry that this is a very, very wrong part of the day, the time that was chosen for you to make this presentation. I see that you have been really struggling through your presentation, and yet you are able to keep focus and answer the questions. So thank you so much. We wish we could see you personally and, appreciate you, but because we are so many miles away, we want to show our appreciation through this digital certificate that is here before you, certificate of appreciation presented to Dr. Michael Campbell in appreciation for his fine presentation entitled No Posts of Honor, a look back at the controversial 1922 General Conference session during the monthly Sabbath Forum organized by the Division of Religious Studies, Spicer Adventist University, given this 15th day of October 2022 at Spicer Adventist University, Pune, India. Signed by our Honorable Vice Chancellor, Dr. Sanjeevan Arsud, and myself, the Dean, and also our coordinator, Dr. Koberson. You will get this certificate, I'm sure, through the email. Once again, I want to thank you so much for taking the time to be with us. Hopefully next time we will have a better time when you could be more alert. But nevertheless, we really appreciate the sacrifice you have made to be with us. Thank you so much. And God bless you, and God bless your ministry as well.
Thank you. And thank you everyone for your patience at this early morning hour. It's a little more difficult, but even despite that, I hope and pray that it's been beneficial. It's been wonderful privilege to spend time with each of you. Also, special greetings to all of our friends at IS Ronald. Some of our happiest memories are our time that we spent there at IS. I just saw Dr. Ginger at annual council, and so it was good to see her and be reminded of sweet friends and memories there. And of course, that is how our paths crossed with Dr. Koberson. So once again, thanks to each of you for your kindness and the opportunity to interact and engage with one another. I do hope that you're able to get some copies of my book at some future point. I hope I'll be able to get a few more copies out to Spicer for those that would like some copies. I think, Dr. Koberson, I sent you one, both for you personally, and then one for the library. So there should be at least a copy for the library there too. So if you have some more questions on some of the details of the material, you can check my research notes that go along with my book as well.
All right. Thank you, Dr. Campbell. Thank you, Dr. Mohandas Israel. Thank you, my friend, Pastor Ronald, and everyone who completed our forum. We were here from the beginning till now. I want to make an announcement that our next forum will be next month on November 19. November 19, every third Sabbath of the month is our forum. So kindly look forward to that. And right now we will have a closing prayer from Benjamin Suna, who is, I believe, in the third year of his theology study here at Spicer. Benjamin.
Let's pray. Father in heaven, Lord, thank you so much for being with us. Thank you for the beautiful presentation. And Lord, as we are in the last days, I pray that you will help us to be faithful and help us to be more like you and less like us, oh God. I pray, Lord, that you will bless each and every one of us present here. I pray, Lord, that you will help us to love you and help us to prepare for your second coming. And I pray, Lord, that you will be with Doctor, and you'll be with his family as well. Thank you, God, for everything. Hear my prayers. We love and we miss you. In Jesus' name I pray. Amen.
Amen. Thank you, Benjamin. Thank you, Dr. Campbell. Now I hope you can have some rest now. Thank you.
I know.